Work starts at 4 Eastern Time, considering appropriations for the Agriculture, Commerce, Justice, Transportation, and HUD departments. And at 5:15, a judicial nomination with a vote at 5:30. You're watching live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Lord God, full of compassion and love, all that is within us praise and magnify your holy name. Today, incline the ears of our senators to hear your voice as you fill them with your power. Bless all who work on Capitol Hill, inspiring them with your spirit and encouraging them with your presence. May your grace give them each day a vivifying sense of renewal. Lord, make us all sensitive to understand our mutual needs and the importance of working in harmony and respect one for the other. We pray in your wonderful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., October 17, 2011, to the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Richard Blumenthal, a senator from the state of Connecticut, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in morning business till 4 p.m. today. Following that morning business, the Senate will begin consideration of H.R. 2112, which is the vehicle for the Agriculture, Commerce, State Justice, and Transportation Appropriation Bills. At 5:15, the Senate will be in executive session to consider the nomination of Kathy Bisson, the United States District Judge for the Western District of Pennsylvania. At 5:30, there will be a vote on confirmation of that nomination. At 4 o'clock, as indicated here, Mr. President, we're going to move to the appropriations bill. I understand there are a number of amendments on both sides that are available to be offered. I hope senators would come and offer them as quickly as possible. We'll try to work out time agreements, and I'm anxious to set up some votes before the weekly party caucuses tomorrow. Mr. President, Bart Giamatti was really a well-rounded man. He was president of Yale University and also commissioner of Major League Baseball. He once called education the, quote, heart of a civil society, close quote. But he also said the heart of education is the act of teaching. The commitment to educate the children of this nation is our greatest investment in our collective future. It's the key to keeping the American dream alive and crucial to staying competitive in a global economy. Teachers are the stewards of that investment. But the terrible recession that has rocked our national economy has threatened their ability to give our children the education they deserve. Since 2008, state and local budget cuts have cost this country 300,000 education jobs. Nearly 200,000 of those jobs were lost in the last year alone. Schools are feeling the pinch of a larger class size throughout their schools, especially at the elementary and middle school levels. The number of children in elementary school classrooms has a direct correlation to student achievement and even to college graduation rates. Districts also have shortened school days, school years, and eliminated summer school programs to help underprivileged children compete in the world. And they've cut art and music classes and after-school activities that keep students engaged and prevent everything from high school dropouts to delinquency to even teen pregnancy. While these cuts have been difficult, things could be much worse. The Recovery Act and the Education Jobs Fund provided money to keep 422,000 teachers in the classroom for a year. School districts across the country use that federal funding to keep class sizes small and ensure students are getting the world-class education they deserve. They use this funding to ensure America's children are trained for the jobs of today and prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. Still, as the economy continues to struggle, so do state and local budgets. And that means schools that are already doing more with less will continue to be at risk. Although Democrats have saved hundreds of thousands of teacher jobs already, schools have still lost 300,000 educators since this recession began. And the brain drain could even get worse. State and local budgets could cost as many as 280,000 teacher jobs next year unless we do more. That's why President Obama proposed we invest $30 billion as part of the American Jobs Act to keep our schools well-staffed to ensure our children are well-educated. This is not deficit spending. This is money that will be paid for. Republicans blocked that job-creating legislation which would have put 2 million people back to work in classrooms and construction strikes across the country. But Democrats haven't given up on keeping our schools fully staffed. Nearly 300,000 teacher jobs, I repeat, are at risk, and so is the quality of our education system. Unless school districts get a helping hand, many will be forced to make more difficult choices between laying off educators, going without school books, paper, and other supplies. Democrats will pursue the President's plan to keep nearly 400,000 teachers and support staff where they belong, in the classroom. A $30 billion investment, fully paid for, will help school districts not only avoid layoffs, but also rehire tens of thousands of teachers who already lost their jobs because of budget cuts. We'll also commit $5 billion to retaining the police, firefighters, and first responders who work so hard to keep our communities safe, and to rehiring those who have already been laid off during these tough economic times. Our economy cannot afford to lose more jobs. Our communities cannot afford to lose the men and women who keep us safe and secure. And our nation cannot afford to lose the competitive edge a world-class education system gives us in a constantly changing world. Democrats are committed to protecting the heart of an education that Bart Giamatti spoke of, the talented teachers who will shape our civil society. Mr. President, would you announce the business of the day?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 4 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, the senator from Arizona is recognized.
I come to the floor today to discuss the Jobs Through Growth Act that was recently introduced by most of my Republican colleagues on this side of the aisle, and I'd like to highlight the hard work done by my colleagues, Senators Paul and Portman, in putting this bill together. This bill is a common-sense alternative to the plan being championed by President Obama and Majority Leader Reid. The difference between our plan and theirs is that we want to create jobs through growth, and they want to create jobs through government spending. We believe that business creates jobs in America. It's clear from the President's stimulus, too, that he believes that government creates jobs. So there is a fundamental difference between our proposal and theirs, and what they have proposed is another stimulus. We tried that. We saw the movie before. It didn't work. It added to our debt and deficit, and we lost jobs. My colleagues and I are putting forth a plan to create jobs through sound policies, and most economists will tell you that economic growth is a fundamental part of a long-term sustainable job creation, and that's what the plan does. It contains key components, spending reforms, including a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution to give job creators the certainty that Washington will not continue to grow unchecked. Almost all of us understand from experience over the years that unless the United States of America, our government, is required, as every state and every town and every county and every city in America is required to do, and that's have a balanced budget, we will continue to amass deficits that mortgage our children and our grandchildren's futures. Republican and Democrat presidents alike over the years have asked for an enhanced rescission authority, what we used to call the line item veto, that would give the President of the United States the ability to eliminate unnecessary, wasteful, earmarked pork barrel spending provisions without having to veto the entire bill. We believe that these two measures can bring about a fiscal discipline in this Congress and in this nation that has been sadly lacking for a long, long time and has given us the massive debts and deficits, a deficit of around nearly $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in America today. We need tax reforms. Is there anyone in America that doesn't believe that the tax code, which is this high, does not need to be reformed? Our proposal is simple. Cut the corporate tax rate from 35 to the tax rate from 35 to 25. Create three categories of tax rates in America, and close the loopholes, eliminate the subsidies, and let's give Americans a tax code that they can trust and believe in, even understand. There's up to $1.4 trillion. Let's bring home the $1.4 trillion in foreign earnings that's trapped overseas in countries where U.S.-based multinational companies do business. Why won't they bring the money home? And it's because they'd have to tax it at 35%. It isn't that much more complicated. Senator Hagan and I last week introduced a bill which would provide incentives for that money to come home on the proviso that they create jobs in America and invest in America. That, according to a recent study done for the Chamber of Commerce, the repatriation of this $1.4 trillion in corporate earnings currently trapped overseas could result in increasing the gross domestic product by roughly $360 billion and the creation of as many as 2.9 million new U.S. jobs. Recently there was, I must say that from the other side of the aisle, there was a study that showed that this money would have no effect. How in the world could you possibly believe that if you brought $1.4 trillion back home to America, it would have no effect? I think it probably shows that really, that you can probably have a study that shows that there was indeed landing of aliens in a city in Nevada a long time ago, in New Mexico a long time ago. Reforming the regulatory process costs taxpayers nothing, but does more for creating jobs than any stimulus program possibly could. There is nothing more constraining to job growth than the adversarial relationship between business and government. Talk to any business person, small or large, and they will tell you why they are sitting on large sums of money and not creating jobs and not investing it. It's because they don't know which regulation is coming down next that they are going to have to comply with. And please, I ask my colleagues and my friends, go ask the business people. They will tell you that. They will tell you that the fear and specter of additional regulations are an incredibly negative effect on their desire to invest and hire. Lifting the prohibitions on offshore energy exploration will immediately create jobs, drive investment, and reduce our nation's dependence on foreign sources of oil. According to the American Energy Alliance, which is a exploratory group, admittedly, permanently lifting the offshore moratoria would result in 1.2 million new U.S. jobs. And, of course, we need to give the President the fast-track authority to negotiate trade agreements. I would point out that the President is now on his listening tour at taxpayers' expense, and he was taking credit for the passage of these three bills for free trade agreements for Panama, Colombia, and South Korea. It only took nearly 3 years. As far as our bill is concerned, we have a statement from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Yesterday, a group of senators, including John McCain, Rob Portman, and Rand Paul, introduced the Jobs Through Growth Act. This legislation marks a departure from a, quote, government knows best approach and instead empowers the private sector to rescue our economy. As the Chamber pointed out in its 6-point jobs plan, alleviating regulatory burdens, tax uncertainty, and restoring confidence to invest and grow jobs is the best way to get the country back on track. This bill is a step in the right direction and includes a number of the same broad-based ideas for creation of the Chamber's plan. It goes on to talk about comprehensive tax reform is critical to job creation. They believe that reforming the regulatory process is necessary for businesses to begin hiring again, and they also argue for the expanded drilling offshore. So you will hear from various liberal think tanks that we really don't create jobs, that this is not a good thing to do, et cetera. But the fact is that the Chamber of Commerce, which I think knows well about job creation, should be paid attention to. Doug Holt, a piece that was in the National Review Online, Doug Holtz-Aiken, a noted economist and former head of the Office of Management and Budget, and in interest of full disclosure, an advisor of mine, wrote the following. Senate Republicans have just introduced the Real Jobs Plan. As I've long argued, an effective jobs plan is a commitment to a sustained environment for long-term growth. The President's failed proposals have repeatedly proven that, quote, temporary and targeted, unquote, stimulus. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for such additional time as I may consume.
Without objection.
He goes on to say the President's failed proposals have repeatedly proven that temporary and targeted stimulus is insufficient. Moreover, his latest effort displays more interest in politics than growth. Senators McCain, Paul, and Portman have proposed a plan that effectively targets job creation at a time when we desperately need it by incentivizing growth and repealing the job-killing Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank law. There's a lot here to like. Still, inevitably, there will be a war of numbers in which progressives trot out numbers from Keynesian business cycle models to argue that the strategy won't work. To anticipate the debate, here are some highlights of the Real Jobs Plan and some estimates of the jobs impact. Lower the corporate rate tax to 25%, resulting in an additional 581,000 jobs per year on average. Reduce the tax on foreign earnings brought back to the U.S., resulting in 2.9 million jobs. Repeal Dodd-Frank, estimated to cost the U.S. 4.6 million jobs by 2015. I'd like to mention on the so-called Dodd-Frank Act, which was supposed to make sure, the whole purpose of the Dodd-Frank Act was to make sure that no institution in America would ever be too big to fail. My friends, tell me that these institutions aren't too big to fail. We know they've gotten bigger, and we know they're too big to fail, and we know if we went through a similar crisis, because of their size, we would again be forced to use taxpayers' dollars to bail them out. The fact is that Dodd-Frank bill has been a complete failure, as many of us predicted it. One of the reasons is because it didn't address the phasing out of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and it was the housing crisis that started this collapse, and until the day that the housing market stabilizes, we will not begin to emerge from this horrible economic situation America finds itself in today. Repeal the ACA, recommended to cost the economy at least 800,000 jobs. Lift the offshore drilling moratorium, resulting in 1.2 million jobs. Prohibit the EPA from regulating greenhouse gases, estimated to cost the economy 1.4 million jobs by 2014. And, of course, giving the President trade preference authority. Now, Mr. President, I've outlined what I think is a proposal which is finally, I'd like to point out in the Wall Street Journal Political Diary, October 14, 2011, and I quote from the Wall Street Journal, finally a GOP growth plan. Senators McCain and Rand Paul and Rob Portman have drafted an economic growth blueprint that they hope to be the rallying cry of all congressional Republicans. The White House and congressional Democrats hope to use the Senate rejection of the Obama jobs plan this week as a campaign issue to, quote, do nothing Republicans. Senate Democrats have quote, the Republicans have no jobs plan of their own, but that's not true any longer. Senators McCain and Rand Paul and Rob Portman have drafted a comprehensive economic growth blueprint that they hope will be the rallying cry of all congressional Republicans in the weeks ahead. We obtained a copy of the draft document, which includes tax cuts, a balanced budget amendment, Obamacare repeal, and a regulatory freeze. The plan would cut corporate tax rates to 35 from 25. It's partially paid for by offering a reduced 5% tax on repatriated capital. The plan won't get close to 60 votes necessary in the Senate, but it does establish a polar star for Republicans to head towards. Republicans got a nice lift for the plan when the Chamber of Commerce poll asked 1,300 business owners across the country whether they support the GOP plan of, quote, permanent tax cuts and less regulation, or the Democratic plan of temporary payroll tax cuts and public works spending. More than 8 of 10 said they favor the Republican approach. So, Mr. President, as they say, let the games begin. So today, the President of the United States, in his visit to areas of the country that have a lot to do, in the view of many, with the upcoming electoral calendar, attacked our plan and attacked it rather vociferously. In fact, I was somewhat taken aback since the President and his spokesperson had billed his trip as a taxpayer paid visit. And in his remarks, the President was very strongly condemning of the plan that we have put forward. We got his remarks. In fact, I remember my colleagues and friends, the President made these remarks on a taxpayer paid for riding in a Canadian bus visit for the next 3 days. And this is what, on his listening tour, the President said. Now it turns out that the Republicans have a plan, too. I want to be fair. They put forward this plan last week. They called it the Real American Jobs Act, the real one. That's what they called it, just in case you're wondering. So let's take a look at what the Republican American Jobs Act looks like. Turns out the Republican plan boils down to a few basic ideas. They want to gut regulations. They want to let Wall Street do whatever it wants. They want to drill more. They want to repeal health care reform. That's their jobs plan, et cetera. So on the taxpayer-paid dime, the President is now traveling, attacking the Republican plan, obviously, I think, unfairly. And by the way, there's an article from dated October 16th by Richard Wolff, USA Today. President Obama will kick off a 3-day bus trip through small towns in politically competitive North Carolina and Virginia Monday, but White House officials insist the trip is about jobs, not votes. So much so, in fact, they convened a conference call to reiterate that point several times, pointing out that the trip is fully on the taxpayers' dime, not the Republicans' re-election campaign. So the President has taken to the road, and he spent a number of minutes attacking our plan, and I understand that. I think he has certainly in a political venue, the right and privilege to do that. I think the question might be, though, is that appropriate on the taxpayer's dime, since it is clearly campaigning? And I must say again, I've never seen an uglier bus than the Canadian one. He's traveling around on a Canadian bus touting American jobs. So, and one of the reasons why Americans and I and my colleagues are a bit skeptical, because we've seen this movie before. We saw this movie before. It feels a bit like something we've heard before. In fact, let me give you a few quotes. We all know the failure of the last stimulus bill. We all know that the President said, and his economic advisors, if we pass the last stimulus bill, that unemployment would be at a maximum of 8.8%. It's obviously, we all now, stuck at over 9%. They said that it would create millions of jobs. We all know that it didn't. It said that it would stimulate our economy, and we know that it hasn't. So let me give you a couple of quotes from, this one was February 10th, 2009, President Obama. It's a plan that will save or create up to 4 million jobs over the next 2 years. And the jobs of firefighters, teachers, nurses, and police chiefs that would otherwise be eliminated if we don't provide states with some relief. President Obama, on 2009, middle of 2009, we've created and saved, as you said, Joe, at least 150,000 jobs. Vice President Biden, in 18 months, stimulus will, quote, create 3.5 million jobs, literally drop kicks us out of this recession. This is a monumental project, but I think it's doable. But I just think we got to stay on top, and we got to stay on top of that on a weekly basis, because this is about getting this out and spend in 18 months to create 3.5 million jobs and to set this up so the rest of the good work that's being done here drop kicks us out of this recession and we begin to grow again and begin to employ again. That was Vice President Biden remarks at Recover Plan implementation meeting on February 2009. Then my favorite, my all-time favorite, on August 24th, 2009, quote from Vice President Biden, "In my wildest dreams, I never thought it would work this well." In my wildest dreams, I never thought it would work this well. Well, anyway, in my wildest dreams, I hope that the American people will understand that what we're doing here with the President's plan and what we will be voting on in pieces and even probably a simple majority of the Senate probably wouldn't have voted for, is the same thing that they tried in 2009 and 2010, was steadfastly rejected by the American people in the overwhelming vote that took place last November. Now, what I hope is that we could, once the President gets off of the campaign trail, that we could sit down and come to agreement in some areas. All of us agree that simplification of the tax code is something that the American people want and deserve. All of us know that we should try to do what we can to bring home that $1.4 trillion which is now parked overseas. All of us agree that offshore drilling is something that we need to accelerate as quickly as possible and safely. And all of us should agree that middle-income and lower-income Americans are the ones who need help the most. And while I'm here, Mr. President, I would like to point out that one of the key elements that we spent a lot of time last year on, many, many hours I spent on the floor of this Senate trying to combat the program that is now known as Obamacare or health reform. And we find out that one of the key elements of this health care reform, I will politely call it health care reform, was a program called the CLASS Act. Now, what the CLASS Act was to provide long-term care for Americans, which is certainly a worthwhile, senior Americans, which is a worthwhile goal. Thanks to a member of the Senate who is not here, Senator Gregg, thank God, put in a provision that said that the CLASS programs was required, the CLASS programs' reality to match the promises as a matter of law. In other words, if Health and Human Services couldn't provide an actuarial analysis of the 75-year cost of the program that ensures solvency throughout such a 75-year period. In other words, the Health and Human Services Department was bound by that amendment that Senator Gregg, the former senator from New Hampshire, put through on this floor. So after flailing around for 19 months, the Secretary of Health and Human Services announced that it would shutter a voluntary long-term care insurance program that was included in the health care law and throws the issue back to Congress. So because of that, and unfortunately we did not have that same provision in the rest of the bill, otherwise the whole thing probably would have been junked by now, they were forced, the administration has been forced, to junk the CLASS Act. So the Wall Street Journal this morning goes on to say, quote, at a minimum, the GOP could begin by repealing the CLASS program altogether since its legal authority is still intact. Quote, one should never leave a partly loaded gun on the table, even if most of the chambers are empty or just house blanks, write the American Enterprise Institute's Tom Miller. He also suggests attaching a few of the more destructive provisions and forcing Democrats to defend them, such as Mr. Orszag's Independent Payment Advisory Board of 15 political appointees who have broad, unaccountable powers to control health care markets and health care. Our suggestion, this is from the Wall Street Journal, our suggestion is for a Gregg-like amendment that applies to the entire health law, not simply class. If reality can't match the rhetoric that accompanied the bill about fiscal responsibility, bending the cost curve, keeping your health care if you like your health care, and all the other false promises, then legally it should be repealed like class. Call it Truth in Advertising Clause. Obamacare would collapse in a heartbeat. So I hope that we will begin to debate whether the Class Act should, which now the Health and Human Services Secretary has announced is undoable, whether it should be repealed from the law itself. And shouldn't other provisions such as that Senator Gregg in his foresight was able to force into the bill when at the time of its passage? And if anyone believes, and by the way, a little bit more on the Class Act, one of the major reasons why it was included was to distort the numbers as to how much money would or would not be saved in passage of health care reform. Because clearly, and for the first early years, since people would be contributing rather than taking out funds because of retirement age, it would appear to have a significant cost savings impact. We will be talking about now the real cost impact of the health care reform bill. So, Mr. President, I hope that in the weeks ahead we can engage in vigorous debate on how we can move this country forward. There's clearly philosophical differences between the two sides, but I also hope that there are areas where we can find common ground. The housing crisis is still with us in America. I noticed an article over the weekend of the New York Times that Fannie Mae saw fit to send a huge number of people to some convention in Chicago on the taxpayers' dime. Fannie and Freddie are still responsible for about 90% of the mortgages in America, a corrupt institution. And yet, Americans, including those in my state of Arizona, are still badly hurting. So I hope we can address the issues that affect this nation. I hope we can sit down together and work out at least some agreements, such as reform of the tax code and others. But at the same time, we need to, at some point, address the housing issue in America. And until we do, until we get housing costs stabilized in America, I greatly fear, and I see my colleague from Florida, whose state has also been very, very badly hurt by this housing crisis, that we have got to stabilize housing prices in America. And until we do, and fix the fundamental problems, then I still fear that we will experience a very difficult economic times for our citizens. Mr. President, I note the presence of my colleague and great astronaut and fine senator from Florida on the floor, and so I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I could spend the whole time talking about the housing crisis, as the senator from Arizona has so appropriately commented to have hit his state and mine and many others. And I happen to agree that it's going to be hard for us to recover economically until we can start to work off this huge, huge inventory of houses that are out there and the dire economic straits that it has put the owners of those houses in. It's a truth in America that so often our family assets are really in our home. And when that home goes away because you can't sell it and its value is plummeted and the bank's coming after you and you can't get loans for your small business, then people are hurting, and that's what's happening to our people right now.
Just for a question, I know he has another subject he wants to address, but yield for a question.
Of course.
Isn't it one of the fundamental problems in the housing crisis in your state, my state, particularly California, Nevada, and others that were at the crest of the wave, is it shouldn't we have made, and still shouldn't we make an effort to give people a mortgage that they can afford to make the payments on, rather than throwing them out of their home or have them leave the home empty? My county of Arizona, Maricopa County of Arizona, has the largest number of vacant homes of any county in America. I'll bet you in that top 10 list there are counties in the state of Florida.
Indeed, one of the areas hardest hit in the entire country is Southwest Florida, in and around Fort Myers. And I note the Senator's comments are very accurate. And if we could find a way in which people could stay in their homes, afford their payments, and what does that do not only for the individual homeowner, what does it do to the neighborhood? It keeps people in the homes. The weeds don't start growing. The values of the rest of the homes in the neighborhood don't plummet because the house is now vacant and perhaps ransacked. And it's kind of a spiral downward. And for us to have a program that would come in and make the mortgage affordable as the person can work out, and yet we find that in many cases the banks don't want to do that, or there's not a governmental incentive for the banks or the homeowner to do that, and we have missed it. Several years ago when this crisis started, I implored the Secretary of the Treasury to look at exactly what was happening, and they came up with a program whereby they were going to give some cushion of 5% of a mortgage underwater. Well, in the Senator's state and my state, if your mortgage is just 5%, if your home is just 5% underwater, you're rather fortunate, because values being of a home today 20, 25, and 30% underneath the value of the first mortgage is not uncommon. And that's the problem that we have not addressed. Now, there have been some other good things. There are now programs coming out on small business in trying to get money into small business, even though some of the banks did not want to take the federal money, even though it went to their capital. We're starting to see some signs of life there. We're starting to see some signs of life, I am told by the Florida Association of Realtors, that sales are occurring all over the state, not just certain parts of the state, like Miami. Huge influx of Brazilian investors coming in and absorbing the condo market there. But it's not just Miami. It's the entire state that sales are occurring. They, of course, are sales at rock-bottom prices, but they're beginning to occur. But we need to accelerate and give assistance to this rejuvenation of the real estate market. And until you do, until the housing market recovers, we're not going to have an economic recovery out of this recession.
Thank the Senator.
I thank the Senator. Mr. President, I came to the floor in order to talk about, over the weekend, a very noble lady in Cuba passed away of a heart attack. And I want to tell you about her. Her name is Laura Pollán. She founded the group of Ladies in White, Damas de Blanco. And she did so to protest this brutal Castro regime in Cuba. And her protest was specifically the jailing of 75 people in a crackdown on dissidents in 2003, one of which was her husband. Many of those that were imprisoned were married to the ones that became known as the ladies in white, including Senora Poyan's own husband, Hector Masada. Since 2003, Laura gathered the group on most weekends in central Havana. After church, everybody was wearing white and they were holding gladiolas, a flower that is typical in warm climates. And they would stage their marches and they would demand the release of their loved ones. Since 2003, when their husbands were jailed, Damas de Blanco defied this brutal dictatorship, the Castro regime. And for its human rights work, the European Parliament awarded the group the 2005 Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. And just this year, the U.S. government gave Damas de Blanco the Human Rights Defender Award for exceptional valor in protecting human rights in the face of government repression. Damas de Blanco succeeded earlier this year, Mr. President. In the face of this brutal dictatorship, it succeeded when the last of the 75 imprisoned were finally released, including Laura's husband. And she and her husband only had 8 months reunited before she died of a heart attack last week. Despite this group's achievement, Laura Poyan lamented earlier this year that as long as the government is around, there will be prisoners. While they've let some go, they've put others in jail. It's a never-ending story. That's what Laura said. Mr. President, it is a never-ending story. And isn't it typical? Here is a regime that still holds an American citizen there now for 2 years, Alan Gross. Alan Gross is in ill health. His daughter back here in the States has cancer. Is this regime showing any kind of compassion? Of course not. Did it show any kind of compassion to those ladies in white and their husbands when they swept in the middle of the night, scooped them up and put them in prison because they dared to speak out their free thoughts? It kind of reminds us of another regime, one on the other side of the globe, Iran, which still imprisons an American, Bob Levinson, a former FBI agent, of which they still deny that they have him, and yet there is plenty of evidence that they do have him, and yet we wait. And in Bob Levinson's case, a wife and 7 children wait and have waited for years and years. And so, Mr. President, we must, like Damas de Blanco, just like they said that they will continue to challenge the regime until the day that all the Cuban people are able to enjoy the blessings of freedom. That's all they want. And it's so sad that because of the ties between America and Cuba, with so many families having been split, with it only 90 miles away from Key West, there is a brutal dictatorial regime that still imprisons its people. But you know, Mr. President, there's one thing they can't imprison. They can't imprison their minds and their yearning for freedom. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
A quorum call in the Senate with senators offering general speeches for the next hour or so. At 4 o'clock, senators will begin deliberations on annual federal spending legislation for the Agriculture, Commerce, Justice and Science, and Transportation, Housing and Urban Development appropriations bills. That'll last until about 5:15 when the Senate will consider the nomination of Kathy Bassoon to be a district court judge for the Western District of Pennsylvania. And then at 5:30 they're expected to vote on that nomination. You can see that live right here on C-SPAN 2. The House, of course, not in session all this week. Members are off for a district work period. No legislative business will be conducted, but you will see the House gavel in twice this week for quick pro forma sessions. You can see the House live on C-SPAN. Also live this afternoon, former Senator John Sununu will be a part of a forum looking at the influence of Congress on foreign policy. It's at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. You can see that live beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern. It will be on C-SPAN. Well, as this quorum call continues on the floor of the Senate, a short time ago, Senate Democratic leaders held a briefing to announce that they'll be offering the first part of the president's $447 billion jobs bill in the Senate. As you know, the president's plan went down to defeat in the Senate last week. President Obama then announced that he'd break the plan into separate pieces to try to get it approved that way. We understand Majority Leader Harry Reid is expected to introduce the first part of that legislation sometime today. The president is on the road for the next couple of days looking for support for his jobs program. He spoke to teachers and first responders earlier today at the Asheville National Carolina Regional Airport. This afternoon at about 5, the president will be offering remarks at West Wilkes High School in Millers Creek, North Carolina. By the way, you can see that at cspan.org. This is the first of a 3-day bus tour that the president is taking through North Carolina and Virginia.
Thank you.